You're listening to an extra shot episode on the Project Zion podcast, a shorter episode that lets you get your Project Zion fix in between our full-length episodes. It might be shorter time-wise, but hopefully not in content. So regardless of the temperature at which you prefer your caffeine, sit back and enjoy this extra shot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Project Zion podcast. This is Brittany Mangelson, and I will be your host for this episode. We are actually doing something that we have never done on Project Zion before. So I have on David Howlett. David is a scholar and a historian and a professor at Smith College in Massachusetts. And his students recently did a class project that might have some interest to the Community of Christ crowd, whether you are a lifelong member or a seeker. And that project is a podcast on women's ordination in Community of Christ. And so when the Project Zion team, heard about this podcast series, this project that these students had done, we decided that it would be great to share it on our platform. So I have David on today, and we are going to introduce the project. He's going to share a little bit more about it, and then we will dive right into the first episode. And so over the next several weeks, you will be able to hear this project. So David, I'm really excited to have you on today. And why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a visiting professor of religion at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. I'm a scholar of religion in America with interests also more broadly in globalization of Christianity, pilgrimage, and in specifically the history of the Community of Christ in the late 20th century. So I've written about that in books in the past and articles, and this in particular arises partially out of that interest, but also out of a class project where I have pedagogical goals where I'm trying to help students learn things about historical research and other kinds of skills, in this case about how do you write and produce a podcast.
I absolutely love that. I love when the academic side of studying history in the world can be used for practical projects, which is exactly what this is. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this project? How did it start? Like, what was the driving behind it, the driving force behind it, and really what's its purpose?
This project itself, which is a series of podcasts that are student-produced, student-written, came out of my course that I offered in the spring semester at Smith College called Mormonisms. I know that term is pretty loaded, like any important term is, in terms of like people have different understandings of that. And certainly folks in Community of Christ do, but it's a term I use for legibility to let students know what we might be talking about in the class. I make it plural too, because I let them know, we're talking about many forms of that, not simply one dominant form. And so I always have a view that when I'm teaching about religion, and especially when I'm teaching about a very specialized class on something like Mormons, I'm not just teaching about religion, I'm helping students understand broader processes about how does gender or race or class work in terms of social formations over time. I'm a historian, so I think of it in historical terms too. And so this particular project is about women's ordination in Community of Christ, thinking about how did that process in terms of the women's ordination movement originate? What was it like in the 1980s on the controversy over women's ordination? And what were the experiences of women who were ordained? Now, that in itself, it's important maybe to our audience in terms of people being Community Christ or interested in Community Christ. They could find something interesting in that particular story. But it's also a story that's larger than that, of talking about late 20th century American Christianity. And in the 70s and 80s, there were lots of fights and denominations about could women be ordained. This is true also of American Jews. This is true of American Buddhists. It's a much larger phenomenon. So it's a phenomenon thinking about who has access to social authority and power and who can be empowered in a community. It goes much, much larger than a relatively small denomination. So, and we see different kinds of responses to denominations everywhere. For instance, the Southern Baptists in the same time period take away women's ordination from women who are already ordained. And so other groups give it to women who hadn't offered it before. So there's no inevitable outcome that comes in this story. And the story of our denomination, too, is a variation of the story that exists out there. So that's my kind of like bigger kind of goal that I have as a scholar of religion in America, that I wanted my students to kind of understand whether or not they're all that interested in the community of Christ as a thing to study, as I am.
And so the actual project, like you said, it's a series of podcasts. Why don't you get into a few of the details of that? I've listened to most of them, and I really appreciated them because the students are talking to the voices of people who lived that experience firsthand. You know, we're kind of on the front lines of the community of Christ story. So just can you give us a brief, reflection on that?
Yeah. To get into this process, the students first had to know something about community of Christ. So we did some research into that. They had to know something about the secondary literature on community of Christ in women's ordination, which is rather thin, actually. And they had to write a research paper on that. And then they had to interview 7 different women. There were 7 groups, each one interviewing one woman who was ordained in the 1980s or early 1990s. Oftentimes women who became then leaders in community of Christ or had been leaders already in the RLDS church. This included people like Marge Troeh, who was the Women's Commission leader in the 1970s into the early 80s. It included people like Gwendolyn Hawkes Blue, who's on the Standing High Council for Community of Christ. It included people like Becky Savage, who was in the first presidency of Community of Christ. Linda Booth, who served as the first president of the Council of 12 as a woman in Community of Christ. We then had them interview each person with standardized questions, and each set of questions corresponded to a different theme. And then in their group, they had to write an episode in which they took the quotes from these different kinds of interviews that other groups had produced, and they had to produce then their own episode in which it had a narrative that had a beginning, middle, and end, but then addressed the different questions that had been asked across the board to these 7 different women. So it gave them a chance to tell a story about one episode, for instance, about the call. What were their experiences of being called to the priesthood? So there's an entire episode about that. What about the controversy? How did that play out in their congregation, in their family, in their what at the time were stakes around women in the priesthood, or if they had been at the 1984 conference? Some of them had been part of it, before this process, before like Marge Troeh, part of the leadership of what was then the RLDS church, and the process of advocating for it. But that episode gave them the opportunity to talk about that. And then we have later episodes too that talk about denominational ministry, congregational ministry, interfaith ministry, and then about changes. A final episode asking, it's the 7th episode, asking, so what changes have they seen in Community of Christ because of women's ordination? What changes do they hope for the future too? So it's kind of ending with a future-oriented view as well. So the episodes were recorded by the students. They're written by the students. And the title for the podcast too, Women's Rights, a podcast about women's ordination, that was also voted on by the class. So it's a class project, all in all. I helped edit some of it in terms of like some of the content, just to like make sure it's accurate, but beyond that, this is their project and these are their voices. And the music too, something they voted on. I wouldn't have chosen the theme music, but they love this theme music. So I think we'll go with it.
I love that. I love seeing young people be able to have creative expression and freedom to do what they want with their research. I mean, I think it's really inspiring. And, I just want to say that one of the reasons why I wanted to do this collaboration, why I was supportive of it, is because of the narrative style. These podcasts have a different feel than most of Project Zion podcasts. They're very almost journalistic in nature. And I really appreciate that. David, I just want to thank you for sharing these audio files with us and helping us amplify these stories to our little audience. And I'm really looking forward to having our folks hear them. So again, listeners, if you're listening to this, then you are about ready to hear the series. And over the next several weeks, we are going to be sharing one of these episodes with you. So David, any final words that you have for us as far as this project goes?
There is an accompanying website along with the episodes, and the accompanying website does have some images from the archives that we have shared with permission. And it also has a student's generated essay just giving background to women's ordination and Community of Christ. And that student, by the way, quoted a Brittany Mangelson in that essay, believe it or not.
I noticed that, actually.
So there we go. That student did that research on her own. I didn't point her to that at all. So, I mean, she found that by Googling, and then she's a good writer. And it's intended for someone who has no background in Community of Christ to be able to understand, well, what's going on here, who's just interested in the idea of women's ordination.
Yeah.
So the website helps situate that a little bit more too.
Yes, and we will be sure to link that website in the show notes so you can get more background information on the project. And thank you so much, David. Thank you for joining us in this collaboration. I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you for hosting us and giving us this opportunity.
This is Women's Rights, a podcast about women's ordination, written and produced by students at Smith College.
I'm Gabby.
I'm Sophia.
And I'm Lydia.
We are your hosts for this episode of Women's Rights. This season, we are exploring the story of women's ordination in Community of Christ, a church with 250,000 members and formerly named the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This denomination began ordaining women in 1985, and on the 35th anniversary of these first ordinations, we are taking this time to look back on the journey towards women's ordination in Community of Christ. To do so, we've interviewed women ordained in the first decade after the 1985 policy change, women who went on to be leaders in Community of Christ. Each episode in this series investigates a different topic, and today we are going to look at the immediate era before women's ordination in Community of Christ. For this episode, we asked each of our interviewees 3 questions to better understand their experience in this era. In our first question, we asked, how would you have explained your church to an outsider in the era before ordination? What did it mean to be RLDS? This question led to a fascinating discussion with our interviewee, Carolyn, a young adult in the 1980s.
Oh, yes. Well, by the time ordination things came along, I think the church leaders, anyway, were leading us in a process of deconstruction about our history. But I think growing up in a conservative RLDS home, my dad was a lay pastor and leader, and I think that usually we were still in the mode of believing in or promoting the idea of the one true church restored through Joseph Smith, somehow that there was a restoration of key New Testament principles and priesthood offices and structures and sacraments, so that it would be a more explanatory approach to help people see the truth of that.
Another interviewee, Charmaine Chvala-Smith, provided more context for what it meant to be a member of the RLDS Church in the 1980s. You'll note that the R in the name RLDS meant a lot to its members, but their name also resulted in them being confused with a much larger church. Charmaine told us.
One of the things that we would typically do if we were meeting someone who was not familiar with the church is that we would so like if we were in a neighborhood and inviting families to bring their children to Sunday school or Sunday school program or a vacation Bible school or whatever, we would knock at doors and we would tell them the name of the church. And we would say, you know, we're members of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then we probably pretty quickly say, not the Mormons. It was almost like it was part of our name to say, not the Mormons. Because Latter-day Saint was in our name, we often had to explain that. So that would be a big part of our identity at that point, was that we were distinguishing ourselves as being separate from Mormons. And so then identifying those things, as we saw, as being unique in our church, different from Mormons, but also different from other Protestants. So that was very important to talk about our uniqueness.
Marge Troeh was head of the RLDS Women's Department in the 1970s and early 1980s. She was an important advocate for women's ordination, and she had extensive experience working with mainline Protestant groups in the era before women's ordination. She told us the following about her experience.
But having to explain about the church, I would say that it is community is the word that I use now, and that would not be a word that I would have used then. Mm-hmm. But a group that is committed to Christ, it believes in modern day revelation, it believes in all are called according to the gifts of God unto them, it believes in stewardship as a response to Christ's ministry. Nowadays, I would say things about committed to peace mm-hmm. And inclusion. But to me, the principle of ongoing revelation is important, and the being a participant in God's world, following the leadership of Christ.
Marge highlighted the progressive ideas that RLDS leaders advocated in the early 1980s, but the responses from other interviewees helped us understand that the RLDS Church was undergoing a seismic shift towards those values in the 1970s and early 1980s. In future episodes, we'll dig deeper into that shift when we talk about the controversy surrounding women's ordination. We knew that ordination in Community of Christ meant something different than what it meant in either a Protestant, Catholic, or LDS setting. But we wanted further clarification about that. So we asked, what does it mean to be ordained in the RLDS Church or the Community of Christ? The responses we received range from personal and reflective to offering a specific definition. Linda Booth recently retired as the president of the Council of 12 Apostles in Community of Christ, one of the church's highest leadership positions. She explained.
What it means to me to be ordained in Community of Christ is that I have the obligation and responsibility to provide sacraments to the people, to be spiritually attuned to God's direction. I was raised all through my life to believe that all people have worth and are called, and that God calls them for specific purposes. But in ordination, that specific purpose is the care and, quote, spiritual feeding of God's people in a unique way.
Additionally, Charmaine Chvala-Smith reflected on the differences in the meaning of ordination through time.
So very much different in that time than this time, I would say. In that time, so this I'm talking, pre-1985, there was very much the sense that, the term often was used, the holy priesthood. So there was a sense, though it would have been denied by some, but that somehow being a priesthood member made you closer to God. And you had different kinds of authority. If you were ordained, you had an authority that was granted to you by the institution. But people tended to look up to you too, as having a validated ministry within the church that could be trusted. It was all men. It was not unusual for young men, maybe usually it was 16 or older. They might be ordained to a deacon or a teacher or priest. Deacons and teachers didn't have any sacramental ministry in the church, but priests did. Priests could baptize and serve communion. And so it wasn't unusual for those 16 or older young men who were very active in a congregation and who looked as though they might be able to get past their own ego needs and serve in some ways, that they might be called to priesthood. So that, and typically, people started out in one of those first three. They're called Aaronic priesthood, that are particularly ministries in congregational life. So deacon, teacher, and priest would typically be what someone would be ordained to initially. And then as they matured or as they became active in the congregation in other ways, they might then be ordained to an elder, was typically a next ordination. And those four offices are the offices that bring ministry in local congregations.
Beyond these congregational ministries, there were higher offices with regional duties or denomination-wide responsibilities.
There are other offices, but they tended to be for more regional or for the whole church. So bringing those kinds of ministry that would be outside of a congregation or within a congregation, but among several congregations, like the 70s who were missionaries. That would be for ministry in a particular congregation, but also for a set of congregations in their area. So, but those four ordinations, deacon, teacher, priest, and elder, were congregational ministry. So within, you might then have high priests who were often administrators of a region or a stake, which is a grouping of congregations. And you would also have, 70s I mentioned, bishops who are deal more with the financial elements, the temporal elements, the buildings, and those kinds of things too. So there's a kind of hierarchy, though by the 80s and 90s, we were very uncomfortable with the idea of there being, different levels of priesthood, and talked about it not being like this, but more like this, serving side by side. So that was already something that was happening before women were ordained, was moving from a hierarchical understanding of the ministries, the different ordinations, to a more horizontal, mutualistic kind of understanding of priesthood. So we're right in the middle of that happening.
The mid-1980s was the era in which women were first ordained, and as Charmaine Chvala-Smith sums up for us, it was a time of great change in how priesthood was understood in Community of Christ.
And there's this distinction being made in the 1980s between ordained ministry and other kinds of ministry, and really a lifting up of the idea that we are all ministers, that children minister to people in a congregation, not just when they're taking up the offering or offering music, but that those who are unordained also have ministries that they bring to the congregation. So we're right in the midst at that point of this really church trying to expand the meaning of what ministry is. So yes, there's the distinction between ordained and unordained, but there's kind of a trying to lift up the unordained ministry as being valuable as well.
Carolyn Brock had a very different context for thinking about women's ordination in the 1980s. While most of our interviewees lived in the American Midwest, Carolyn and her husband worked as missionaries for Community of Christ in Kenya during the 1980s. She relayed the following experiences to us about what ordination meant for her church in rural Kenya.
Well, particularly in village areas, but I was speaking with a group of women, actually men and women, and we had questions from the crowd, and she asked, well, when will women be ordained in our church? And I'm going like, this was like probably a couple of years before it came up as a thing in our body, but that just kind of stopped me. Like I had been raised quite, took on a more demure kind of, I had my own thoughts, but I think that I just sort of accepted all of that the men were the ones who were supposed to be in charge of these things and speak and do all the priesthood roles. So that woke me somewhat. And I think that allowed me, I was listening to other deconstructive voices about our history and the truth of everything that we had.
Carolyn's experience in Kenya allowed her to begin to rethink what it meant to have ordained ministers in her church, part of an evolution in perspective that would continue throughout her life, as we'll see in later episodes. In the third question, we focused on the roles and expectations women and men had within their church before women's ordination. Here, our interviewees provided stories about the church in general, as well as their own personal experiences. Linda Booth told us about the general context. She shared that
before ordination, typically women did women kind of things. They taught church school. They might have taught an adult class. They took care of women's roles in the congregation. The congregation in which I was a member during the more recent years, right before ordination, was very progressive. And so they had asked me on many occasions to both give prayers during worship services and even occasionally to speak. My background was in public relations, and so speaking has always been one of the gifts I believe God has given me. And so that congregation understood giftedness and used women in a variety of roles. One role they did not use women in was in the presiding role during the services. But typically, nearly any other role other than participating in the sacraments was welcomed in that congregation.
Linda then expressed how this experience was not universal.
I believe it was quite unique. There were a few families that would complain, for example, if a woman was on the rostrum. But in general, this congregation was very, very accepting. And I know that was unusual. It was in Olathe, Kansas, which is about 30 miles west of Independence, Missouri. And we were a very gifted congregation with a lot of young families. And so therefore, I believe we had that ability to move and minister in a way that might not have been appreciated in other congregations.
Becky Savage grew up in the greater Kansas City area. She too reflected on some of the gender differences in church life before women's ordination.
Women did pretty much everything in the congregation except serve the sacraments. So they were engaged in Sunday school class. There were active women's organizations, a women's group. They would be engaged in preparing worship services. So I was on the worship planning committee and helped put worship services together. They were engaged in music ministry. They were helping plan activities that went beyond. So we were in a stake in this central area called Kansas City Stake. So we were engaged with ministries in the Kansas City Stake as well that were taking our congregation members and helping them be more engaged in the bigger group, which was the Kansas City Stake, a group of other congregations. Men were engaged predominantly in priesthood ministry unless they were not ordained. Those who were not ordained, it depended on what level of commitment they wanted to provide in the congregation. If they were very active and volunteering, they could do whatever they wanted to do, up to the limitation of not performing the sacraments, and to some extent not presiding at a Sunday service. So that was pretty much limited to those in a high priest or an elder office, which were the men. So and I was in a much more, I would call liberal or more open congregation, which was much more accepting of whatever the giftedness of the individuals were, and however much they wanted to contribute, they were more than welcome to contribute in that congregation, which was wonderful. And it allowed for much more diversity of giftedness and caring of the members as a whole.
Jane Gardner serves as the presiding evangelist for Community of Christ, an office that functions almost like a spiritual director for the entire church. But in the early 1980s, she was in her early 20s and a pastor's wife. She reflects on her involvement in the church as a pastor's wife, and as well as the roles that she held in the church in her early teens.
My husband was pastor, 15 years maybe. As a bivocational minister, he was a high school physics chemistry teacher, but then he was also ordained as an elder. So he was pastor. And pastor's wife had its own job description in terms of, if someone was sick, or if it was somebody's birthday, or it was just, there were some expectations for what the pastor's wife should be doing, which was always very interesting. So that was a role. I was always, even from high school, even before high school, junior high, involved in worship and planning of worship, and then music, because music was my major. So lots of involvement in sacred music and that kind of thing.
Today we discuss the roles that women and men held before women's ordination and how their personal roles in the church changed over time. In our next episode, we will look at the controversy surrounding women's ordination in the 1970s and 80s. As we'll see, changing the policy on women's ordination wasn't an easy process for Community of Christ Church, and many of our interviewees faced significant adversity as they advocated for women's ordination. That concludes our podcast for today. Special thanks to Carolyn Brock, Charmaine Chvala-Smith, Linda Booth, Becky Savage, and Jane Gardner. We'd also like to thank Dan Bennett, Travis Grandy, and Yasmin Eisenhower of the Smith Learning, Research, and Technology team. Thanks to Rachel Kilbrew of Community of Christ Library Archives, and thanks to the Andrew Mellon Foundation that supports public-facing student writing at Smith College. Tune in next week on Women's Rights.
Thanks for listening to Project Zion Podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or whatever podcast streaming service you use, and while you are there, give us a 5-star rating. Project Zion Podcast is sponsored by Latter-day Seeker Ministries of Community of Christ. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are of those speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Latter-day Seeker Ministries or Community of Christ. The music has been graciously provided by Dave Hines.